Okay. So hopefully everything will go right from now. Okay. We really don't want to record that. Okay. So it's a really simple program. Who fired Lew Wallace and when? And we'll talk a little bit about why. I always get ahead of myself. I'm supposed to be Cecily Zander. I don't look like a Cecily. And the talk was supposed to be very different, and it was going to be entirely by Zoom. But 2 weeks ago, she told me she was given an opportunity for a job interview, and she didn't want to turn it down, and it was today and tomorrow. So she felt she couldn't take the night off from the job interview to do the presentation here. So she and I swapped months. I was going to give this thing in March. She's going to give her talk in March. So that's why I'm not female tonight. So as I said, who fired Lew Wallace and when? Or, indulging my whimsical side, we have an alternate title, Lew Wallace's 1862 Summer Adventure. And it was not excellent. At least Lew Wallace did not think it was excellent. Now, here's the man who is the main subject of the presentation, Major General Lew Wallace. You all can read pretty fast, I expect, so I'm not going to bother to read that for you. There's a couple of interesting things that I did not know about when I started doing this. When he became a Major General in March of '62, he was the youngest Major General in the Army at the time. Now, eventually, some guy who was 23 years old got to be made Major General, but that was in 1865. Anybody know who that was? No. Galusha Pennypacker.
Well, Custer was also promoted, but he was a year older than Pennypacker.
Yeah. But the thing that the other thing that was new to me, I looked at several different Wallace biographies for a lot of background on this, and all three of them told me that he was ambitious. He wanted military glory. I mean, they literally said that's one of his motivations. And I think what it came out of was he served in the Mexican War, but his unit saw no combat. So in a sense, he's still the little kid, the young man from 1848, looking for his young man's thrills, even though now he's an accomplished lawyer and somewhat politician in Indiana. Now, we're going to start out talking about material that you can get from his autobiography. It was published in 1906 posthumously because he died in early 1905. It's finished by his widow, but not really. I mean, it literally was finished by cut and paste. Literally. Cut with the scissors, paste with paste. They cut out letters, newspaper articles, speeches he gave, stuff like this, and finished it. And it's really too bad because Wallace's actual authorship work ended literally in the middle of the Battle of the Monocacy, which is July 1864. I mean, literally, he's writing about, I'm about to go to bed tonight, and the next thing is the general died. And his wife starts explaining how they're going to finish the book. And what's sad about that, this guy wrote Ben-Hur. He was the governor of New Mexico during the Lincoln County War, which involved Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. I'd have loved to read his take on those things as sort of a firsthand kind of thing instead of reports and letters and so on and so forth. And that's unfortunate. But it is a very readable book. It's got a lot of interesting anecdotes in it. Unfortunately, at least two of them, which we're going to talk about tonight in some detail, aren't true. Now, I have a bad habit of skipping slides before I should. What happened at Shiloh? What we're talking about all is a consequence of what happened with Lew Wallace at Shiloh. Veteran Civil War nuts probably have a base understanding of that, but I'm going to repeat it anyway, just so that we have a common ground to go on. Grant had 6 divisions at Shiloh. Wallace's was camped away from the other 5. The Confederates attacked the main camp at Pittsburgh Landing. Grant sent Wallace orders to come to the main landing, reinforce the rest of the troops, and join in and fight out the battle. It probably was a 1-hour march. It took Wallace 8 hours. That's a little bit controversial, and it's also a little bit late. As a result, Wallace did not participate in the first day's battle, which might have been a big deal in terms of the outcome of the battle. So everything is following on from that mistake. And if you've ever wondered, where did Wallace get the idea for writing the novel Ben-Hur? It's an allegory for his life after Shiloh. Ben-Hur knocking the tiles down on the Roman general is him showing up late at Shiloh. Everything else is allegorical to what happened to Wallace after that. The movie looks really different when you understand that. So he certainly was relieved after Shiloh, but when? Now that's important, because you would think if he was relieved because he screwed up at the Battle of Shiloh, it would happen fast, right? Shiloh was April 6th and 7th, 1862. Maybe he'd be fired on the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, something like that. But that didn't happen. And secondly, who fired him? Or, since I do remember my 8th grade English teacher's name, by whom was he fired? So it's simple questions, but it's surprisingly not simple to a lot of people. Now, what's commonly believed is that, well, of course, he was fired by Grant, right? Grant was his army commander. Grant told him to come to the landing and help out. And instead of getting there in an hour, he showed up at 7:30 at night and wasn't able to help on the first day. And earlier this year, an online acquaintance of mine published an article, What Happened to Major General Lew Wallace at Shiloh, in a web publication. He was very proud of it. And inside that web publication, he says this: following the battle, Grant relieved Wallace of his command. Now, many of you know I used to be a mathematics professor. Mathematicians are persnickety about precision and facts. So I asked my friend, can you give me a citation for that? Can you give me a source for that? And what he said was, well, everybody knows that. I mean, I'm not joking. That is literally what he said. And what I said in response was, if that's the case, you ought to be able to find me a citation if everybody says that. And secondly, is a footnote in an article. So this generated a very contentious online argument that went on for several weeks, and at no point did anybody come up with a citation for Grant firing Wallace. Now, if you know a little bit about how to run through standard Civil War archives like the official records or the papers of U.S. Grant, Wallace is rather visible and present for somebody who was fired, quote, after Shiloh, unquote. This is a whole list of messages and appearances, so to speak, that come from the period of what I call the creeping siege of Corinth. Now, this is the operation that followed the Battle of Shiloh. Henry Halleck, who was the department commander, he was Grant's superior, concentrated 3 small armies in the general vicinity of Pittsburgh Landing, 120,000 men roughly, and they marched on the Confederate city of Corinth. And Halleck had this belief that capturing Corinth would basically end the war. The straight line distance by air from Pittsburgh Landing to Corinth, Mississippi is 22 miles. It took Halleck 30 days to march that distance. Now, they literally would wake up in the morning in the entrenchments they built the night before, advance 1 mile, and dig another set of entrenchments, which they would wake up in the next day. And so, okay, why didn't it take 22 days? Because the Confederates counterattacked them once, and that shook Halleck so much he shut everything down for a week. And that's how you get 30 days. This was considered a masterful campaign by some, but not by a lot. Now, there are 2 things in here that are important to us going forward. One, Wallace is the first federal officer to occupy Memphis in strength. There was a naval battle on the Mississippi River in front of Memphis in early June. I can never remember if it's the 5th or the 6th of June, but it's one of those 2. And the Confederate fleet was literally annihilated. Every boat that wasn't sunk was captured. Unfortunately, the Federal fleet wasn't carrying too many infantrymen. They left like 3 regiments, a couple of batteries, and maybe some cavalry to occupy the whole city of Memphis, which was the 2nd largest city in Tennessee. So Wallace learns of this because some rider comes into his camp basically screaming for help, that they're afraid they're going to get overrun. Wallace moves his division in. He occupies Memphis for a while. Shortly after that, Grant, I should mention this, Wallace is mentioned in a report from a Colonel B.H. Grierson. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is Benjamin Grierson of the Horse Soldiers fame. On the 23rd, Grant shows up in Memphis with 2 divisions. And immediately Wallace asks for a furlough. And the furlough is granted for 20 days on June 24th. Now, one's first thought might be that this is okay. Grant and Wallace don't get along. And so as soon as Grant shows up, Wallace wants to go home. Except he had 2 very good reasons for wanting to go home. He hadn't seen his wife since September. And he had literally abandoned a law partnership when he went off to war. And he needed to settle that up so that his partner could get the fair share of the money from the work that he had been doing since Wallace had gone off to wear the blue uniform. So if he was fired right after Shiloh, he's doing a good imitation of actually being around all the way to nearly the end of June. Shiloh was the beginning of April. So this is nearly 2 months, and he's still with the Army. So what's going on? Oh, by the way, Henry Halleck did not approve of Wallace occupying Memphis. If you're not familiar with faces, that's Major General Henry Halleck. At the time of this writing, he is the commander of the Department of the Missouri, the Western Department. He is the department commander over Grant, over Wallace, over everybody in that part. And here's the key phrase: there's no danger of an attack in force on Memphis. It is a mere stampede. And he's ordering Grant to find out by whose neglect things happened and make sure that they are punished. Grant is able to convince Halleck that, trying to defend Memphis with only 3 regiments of infantry might not have been a good idea. But this is kind of indicative of some attitudes that we're going to see more of. Now, this is the story that Wallace tells. Obviously, I'm going to add a few, make a few things appear, that Wallace tells about his relief. The gentleman up in the corner is Indiana Governor Oliver Morton, one of the most effective, imperious, and dictatorial Republican governors of any state in the Union. Very powerful man. And something I neglected to mention earlier, Wallace's father was a previous governor of Indiana. Wallace's family is very politically connected. A current United States senator from Indiana is Wallace's brother-in-law. Wallace knows Morton. Morton knows Wallace. This is a connection. It is a speculative guess that this was written in about 1901. I inquired of the people at the Indiana Historical Society, that's who owns the Wallace papers, and they told me that the earliest record that Wallace is writing his autobiography is the fall of 1896. And figuring that he's sort of proceeding forward at a reasonable pace, I am guessing it's 1901 when he gets to this part of the autobiography, based on how much more he has to do before he dies in 1905. Excuse me, technically that's breaking the rules. We're not supposed to have food here. But also we know that Wallace was visiting Shiloh nearly every year about in the early '80s. His last visit was in 1901. He's trying to get the lay of the land right. He's trying to figure out the roads that he traveled on. It's very important to him on April 6th, right? So he's visiting Shiloh, and that's why I'm guessing that this account was written in 1901. And Wallace says, I had no difficulty in the settlement with Mr. Wilson. This is his law partner. Then, and this is important, before the first week of my furlough expired. Now, he's got a 20-day furlough. It starts on June 24th. So a week after June 24th would be June 31st, which most of us would call July 1st. So we're talking very late June, very early July. He gets a telegram from Morton saying, I'd like to see you in Indianapolis. So Wallace comes. He knows Morton. Morton wants Wallace to give speeches in favor of recruiting. Wallace does not want to do it. Why doesn't Wallace want to do it? What did I say on about the third slide? He's ambitious. He wants military glory. You don't get military glory giving speeches to people in southern Indiana. He wants to be back with his division. He wants a combat assignment. one of the problems with this timeline, as Wallace presents it, is the date. We just discussed this is at the latest July 1st. The call for troops that Morton is talking about was not made until July 2nd. Now, there's every reason to believe that the governors knew this was coming. They were probably talking to Lincoln about how many troops should you ask for. And so quite possibly Morton is just trying to get ahead of the game and get his ducks in a row to get somebody to go out and recruit troops for him. But on the other hand, it does kind of suggest maybe Wallace is not being entirely truthful here, or not entirely accurate. I don't want to suggest that he's lying at all. When Wallace says that he doesn't want to do it, Morton produces a telegram which Wallace says is from Secretary of War Stanton, which assigns Wallace to Morton for recruiting. And in response to that, Wallace is hacked off. He starts talking about, you have cost me my command. Morton says, I can get you another command. And Wallace says, no, I don't think so. The man opposed to it is too powerful. And Morton wants to know who it is that's too powerful for him, that he can't get Wallace another command. Wallace says Halleck. He doesn't say Grant. He says Halleck. According to the text in his autobiography, Wallace says Morton, quote, flinched, unquote. I don't believe that. Morton would not flinch from a major general. Certainly not in early July of 1862. So I'm not really buying this the way Wallace is telling the story. As I said, Wallace is not convinced that he can get another command through Morton. All of this is from these pages in the autobiography. And as I've been hinting, well, not really true, probably. Some of this may be due to bad memory. If he's writing this in 1901, it was nearly 40 years ago. But I also think a subtext to tonight's proceedings might be the way that people use autobiographies and or memoirs to make points that they want to make, and don't literally stick to the straight and narrow truth all the time. Now, if you go sleuthing around in some more readily available archives, you can find out some things. For example, there's a footnote in the papers of U.S. Grant, dated, which talks about a telegram on July 31st that Halleck sends to Morton, assigning Wallace to him for recruiting purposes. And apparently he sent a similar telegram the same day to Wallace. This is 115 days after Shiloh. Now, taken at face value here, this is the date that Wallace lost his command, July 31st. That's where I get the 115 days. It's well after the first week of his furlough, right? As a matter of fact, it's after his furlough ended. So what's he doing in Indianapolis? Over 2 weeks after his furlough ended. This is mysterious. But, okay, I've run out of what I can find in Wallace's autobiography. I've run out of what I can find in standard, readily available archives. So let's go looking at the Indiana Historical Society, which holds the Wallace papers. And they have a little chronology, which they don't really advertise very well. I stumbled upon it. And from that, you can get some dates on where Wallace is this summer. On July 9th, he gives an impromptu speech on the Negro question from a hotel balcony in Washington, D.C. On July 31st, the day when probably he was relieved of his command, he's giving a speech in Cincinnati. I believe that's in Ohio, so I'm a little confused as to why he is giving a speech in Cincinnati to recruit troops for Indiana. But Cincinnati is near the Indiana border. And on August 12th, he's giving his speech in Evansville, Indiana. So clearly he's still up in the Midwest. He didn't go back to Memphis. He didn't go back to Tennessee. He didn't go back to Grant's army. What's going on? The furlough should have ended on July 14th. I can find no paper trail that it was ever extended. What the bleep is he doing in the Capitol on July 9th? So obviously it's time to go look at another book. Oops. There. So I went to this book, In the Shadow of Shiloh by Gail Stevens. That is a female Gail. She works at the Indiana Historical Society, which is where the Wallace papers are. So she has very ready access to the entire bulk, or the entirety of the Wallace papers. The book fills in a lot of details, but it is very unsatisfactory in a lot of ways. She very rarely quotes from the archival material she's using. She tells you what's in it in her own words. But from my mathematician / historian perspective, that's unsatisfactory. I wish she would have quoted more from what she did. She talks about a lot of telegrams, and her footnotes point to telegrams, telegram of date between two people, but they don't tell you where the telegram can be found. And that's really bothersome. But this is the best that I could do. I also did look at 2 other biographies of Wallace. So here are the missing details. And there is Mrs. Wallace. Susan is her name. And the first time I saw that picture, reminded me of a woman that I went to high school with. The woman that I went to high school with has that same sort of set to the lips and so on. It was a really, oh my God, that's Nancy Latin. But anyway, to be polite, his wife was a mess. They had not seen each other since September of '61. She was constantly sick, having a lot of bad colds. The absence of her husband, knowing that he was being shot at, was probably not doing her psyche a lot of good. We don't think about it much, but I imagine that there is a form of PTSD that the wives can get waiting at home for their, well, actually nowadays I should say the spouses can get waiting at home for their significant others. Anyway, the plan is they make a plan to sort of take a mini vacation. They have friends in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is north of New York City. So the idea is they're going to go to Poughkeepsie and sort of rest, relax, and maybe this will help Susan get better. And think about 19th century travel from Indianapolis to upstate New York. You don't get in your car and drive diagonally up into Pennsylvania or whatever, go across. You can't do that. You take the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, you go to Washington, D.C. That's a straight shot. And then you take a whole bunch of small railroads up to New York City and then up to Poughkeepsie. So it's natural that they would end up in Washington. It's on the way. Apparently, Wallace went there thinking that he might be able to get a command in the Army of the Potomac. Let's start thinking about the dates again. This is July 9th, is when he is in Washington. July 1st, the Army of the Potomac won the Battle of Malvern Hill and immediately retreated to the banks of the James River. They are not a particularly popular military formation. Wallace quickly figures out that maybe he doesn't want a command in the Army of the Potomac, but he was thinking of it. That's one reason he went to Washington. We do know that the furlough was extended, but the way we know is one of my complaints about the way Gail Stevens constructs her book. The footnote for that statement does not go to any kind of telegram between one military official and another. It's a letter from Susan Wallace to the people they were going to go visit in Poughkeepsie. I could probably go and find that letter in the Wallace papers, and it would be written in 19th century cursive, which these eyes do not read well. And since I had 2 weeks to finish putting this together, I didn't try. I had other things to worry about. But it would have been a lot better to be able, if she had quoted the actual exchange of telegrams. There would have been one from Wallace to somebody. Can I have an extension on my furlough? And then there would have been one from the somebody to Wallace. Yes. Apparently, it was another 20-day extension from the first furlough. I have to say apparently because of the way the events play out and because I can't see the actual document. So there's a supposition here. So also at about this time, Wallace would have learned that his division had been broken up and scattered. About a third of it was sent to Arkansas. Some of it was sent to Sherman's division. The largest part of it was sent to a new reconstituted 3rd Division. Wallace had commanded the 3rd Division of the Army of the Tennessee, and they formed a new one, mostly from his division, but with a lot of it sent away. And the line that unfortunately is below the crop is just the citation of the particular page in Shadow of Shiloh that this came from. So you're not really losing anything by not being able to see that. But here's the big deal. Does anybody not know what the JCCW is? Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. It was formed in the fall of 1861. It's a congressional watchdog committee. It basically exists to make life difficult for Army generals who don't do well. It's sort of a political watchdog committee. The most recent book on the Joint Committee is by a fellow named Bruce Tapp, and it's titled Over Lincoln's Shoulder. And that's a good way to refer to what these gentlemen were doing. But what's interesting about this testimony, by the way, I have a PDF file of the full testimony. It's a government document. It's for free. It exists on a government documents website. But if you want to read it, if you don't want to go looking for it, send me an email and I'll send it to you. I don't know why I didn't have this idea until just now, but what maybe I ought to do is post a link to it on the website and put it on the Facebook page as well. So I'll certainly do that. But if either of those don't work for you, feel free to send me an email. Now, the content of the testimony is interesting, and the fact of the testimony is interesting for two different reasons. Back in his autobiography, Wallace tells a wonderful anecdote. He makes fun of himself. This is what a good writer can do, is, tells a funny story about himself. And he goes on at great length. His headquarters tent was set up along the main road that led from the steamboat landings to the front lines. Wallace's division was always in reserve. They never saw any action. So, as he put it, well, somebody had to be in the reserve. So he's just, sitting back there twiddling his thumbs. Three dudes come down the road from the direction of the steamboat landings. Wallace is a sociable sort. He calls these guys in. Hey, you want to rest? I have some refreshment. I have some cigars recommended by General Grant. He really said that. He might have said, I have some whiskey, but he didn't say anything about Grant recommending it. He certainly had food. And he entertained these guys. And at one point, the most senior of them, he never names them, by the way. He doesn't talk about Major Jones, Captain Smith, and Lieutenant Brown. No, they're just three guys. One of the guys says, well, what do you think of the ongoing campaign? Well, this is during what I call the creeping siege of Corinth. And Wallace unloads. He thinks the campaign is a joke, that we could have captured Corinth weeks ago. We could have defeated the Confederate Army and destroyed at least part of it weeks ago. The conduct of the campaign is insane. It's stupid. He goes on. He just unloads. And then the senior of the three men says, oh, well, thank you for your hospitality, General. We should be on our way. And suddenly, Wallace's brain starts making connections. It's kind of like the neurons had been on hold for a while. These guys came off a steamboat based on the road they're on. The three principal cities that are upstream from the Tennessee River are Cincinnati, that's a long way away. Louisville, that's a long way away. St. Louis, that's not very long away. St. Louis is also where General Halleck's administrative headquarters is located. His headquarters are now in the field because he's leading this set of three armies. Wallace suddenly understands that he is dumped on, pardon the somewhat foul language, he is dumped on the commanding general's conduct of the campaign to three members of Halleck's staff. Yeah, oops. Now, I don't think this happened. Gail Stevens doesn't think it happened. Her reasons are Wallace never wrote about it anyplace else except in his autobiography. I didn't know that, but I was suspicious from the get-go because he never named the guys. And it's just, what would you do if you're being social? Well, hi, I'm General Wallace. What's your name, son? You'd find out who they were. And, okay, we could say after 40 years he'd forgotten their names. Okay, possibly. Now, why is this significant to his testimony? What do you think he testifies about? He testifies about the campaign. What I think is going on here is he does not mention testifying to the JCCW in his autobiography. That whole anecdote about the three guys is a way to get this testimony into his autobiography without saying, I testified to the JCCW. So, and it also, he could be less than perfectly accurate with how he told things, make it more literary. So Yeah, that's what's going on here. Now, he is slightly critical of Grant, much more. Somebody else may have a different opinion. He is asked specifically, what about the allegations that Grant was surprised at Shiloh? And Wallace gives an incredibly intelligent answer. He says, well, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I did talk, meaning he wasn't there when the battle began, but I did talk to some officers who admitted that their regiments were surprised. Now, that's a measured, accurate way to say it. He doesn't go on for 45 minutes or 10 paragraphs about how stupid Grant was. He just says, I don't know. Some people told me they were surprised. Surprisingly, he spends the bulk of his time in terms of the pages talking about the lack of activity back in West Tennessee. They're not doing anything. Halleck has them guarding cities and guarding railroads. The excessive respect for secessionist property, and yes, I did use the scare quotes to refer to slave property because that's what he's talking about. He also mentions the feasibility of a draft and arming freed slaves. Now, he's very proud of that. In lots of other places, he brags about being one of the first general officers to suggest arming the slaves. So now, the big mystery is why did he do this? Yeah. And how was it arranged? One of the prime figures on the JCCW was a man named George Julian, who was a congressman from Indiana. So Wallace is from a political family. We can conclude that he knew Congressman Julian. Perhaps Congressman Julian asked him if he would testify. Perhaps Wallace approached Congressman Julian. We don't know. Gail Stevens doesn't know. She's as mystified about this as I am. All of this is covered in a chapter in her book that is titled, quote, My Great Mistake, unquote. That's clearly supposed to be a quote from Wallace, and one of my many bones to pick with Gail Stevens is she never tells us where that's from. Whether it's from a letter or what. But he did apparently consider giving this testimony his big mistake. So this is an important thing. Gail Stevens has a very, I think, pithy comment about this as to the consequences. All of Wallace's connections and his service to the Union would count for nothing. He would not return to permanent field command for almost 2 years, in large part because of Halleck's power. And now, what's interesting here, if you look at the dates, he gave this testimony when? July 9th. On July 9th, Henry Halleck was the department commander out west of the department that encompassed Western Tennessee, much of Kentucky, a lot of Missouri, and some of Arkansas. On July 11th, Henry Halleck is General-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. Oops. So the guy he spent his testimony insulting and talking trash about is all of a sudden the boss man of the entire Union Army. And that didn't do Wallace any good. Now, we can finally get the full story, digging into the weeds of Gail Stevens's book. And she is guessing some here herself because the paper trail is sketchy. but this is what she puts together. Wallace apparently agreed to help Morton with recruiting 31,000 men was Indiana's quota after he returned from Poughkeepsie. That's why the dates when we were talking about the story as Wallace put it in his autobiography were important to me, because the proclamation calling for the troops hadn't been issued yet. So Wallace spends the time after he gets back from Poughkeepsie, which is after July 9th, because July 9th, he hasn't gone to Poughkeepsie yet. So it's later in July. He's been giving speeches in southern Indiana mostly. On the 28th, Lincoln writes a telegram to Morton. Now, again, Gale Stevens doesn't quote from the telegram, but I can imagine Lincoln saying something about, "Hey, Oliver, you got my men?" And Morton says, "Well, it would be a lot easier if I could have Wallace a bit longer. Oh, by the way, can he have command of these troops?" Now, Lincoln does not respond to that question. Gale Stevens thinks that this is a hidden quid pro quo. That is, Wallace agreed to do the recruiting if Morton would get him command of the troops he recruited. On the 31st, not being aware of this correspondence, apparently, on the 31st, Wallace wires Halleck, telling him the troops will be ready in about 2 weeks if I get to be the commander. Now, while I'm not quoting Halleck here, but in substance, Halleck replies, "Not on your Nelly." I think what he actually says is that the needs of the service will dictate who the commander is. That sounds bureaucratic, which means it sounds like Halleck. Now, 40 minutes after that, according to Stevens, who has actually seen the telegrams, I have not. 40 minutes after this exchange, Halleck sends another telegram to Morton. And now we are on July 31st, remember. And he tells Morton that he can have Wallace. In other words, the furlough can be extended a second time. Now let's think about that timing again. He had a 20-day furlough that was running out on July 14th. That was extended. So that's going to run out on July 34th, which we usually think of as August 3rd. So on July 31st, he needs to be getting ready to go back to Memphis if he's going to go back to Memphis, and he in fact is. But Halleck says to Morton, "You can have Wallace. I'll extend his furlough another 20 days if he desires it." He being Wallace. So it's kind of like Wallace actually was given a choice. What do you want to do? Now, what we know happened is that Wallace stayed. He does run a telegram on August 4th to Grant's chief of staff, Rawlins, asking if Grant has something for him to do. And apparently, there is no reply that's recorded, but apparently he got a negative reply. So he stayed. So, in a sense, what you can say is that Wallace relieved himself, which is an awkward way to put it. But so this is the last paragraph in this chapter in The Shadow of Shiloh. Wallace had chosen to leave his command and remain in Indiana. He had left the command that was securely his and given Halleck the opening he needed to get rid of him. So, if you want, we've answered our questions. When was Wallace relieved? Well, pretty clear from the telegram traffic that it was July 31st is the actual date when he was separated from any command in West Tennessee. Who did it? Well, the combination of Halleck and Wallace. Sounds like a law firm. They were both lawyers. But notably absent from that is the name Grant. Now, some summary. This is actually a favorite telegram of mine, or not telegram, it's a letter that Halleck wrote to Sherman. That's old brains Halleck. It seems but little better than murder to give important commands to such men as blah, 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 and Lew Wallace, and yet it seems impossible to prevent it. What's this about? Well, look, Dave. Yeah. Wallace has just been promoted to command of the very awkwardly named Military Department of the Middle. Most people called it the Middle Department. It was headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. It encompassed all of Delaware, the city of Baltimore, the counties around Baltimore. It was a very political command. It was not a field command. He had a very small force called 8th Corps of troops. He was appointed by Lincoln, and Halleck objected, and Lincoln basically ignored him. And so that's what prompted this expression in a letter to Sherman. Wallace was thankful to get promoted, or not promoted, to get assigned to an actual command, but he still wanted a combat command. That's what he wanted. But when he learned that Halleck was pissed off that he'd been given any command, he took it in a heartbeat. If this is putting a burr under Halleck's butt, yeah, I'll take it, just to make him mad. Well, what happened? In the summer of 1864, actually about 3 months later, less than, a bunch of Confederates come storming through Maryland. They're commanded by Jubal Early. They have come up the Shenandoah Valley. They're headed for Washington, D.C. Grant is scrambling to get troops on steamboats up north to reinforce the capital. He's gotten one division up there. The only disposable field force in the area is 8th Corps, commanded by Wallace. So Wallace heads out, reinforced by this one division from the Army of the Potomac, and gets slaughtered at Monocacy Junction. That's known as the Battle of Monocacy. It's basically where I-270 crosses the Monocacy River. It's not very far from DC. But that delay saved Washington because it delayed Early an entire day. And this is what Grant thought of that. He wrote about it in his memoirs. Wallace moved with commendable promptitude to meet the enemy at the Monocacy. And then this, which I really think is the money quote, if you will. General Wallace contributed on this occasion by the defeat of the troops under him a greater benefit to the cause than often falls to the lot of a commander of an equal force to render by means of a victory. In other words, by losing the battle, Wallace won the campaign because that extra day allowed Grant to get more troops into Washington, D.C., so Early had no chance to take the city. So that is the end of the presentation. Let me, as we usually do, turn off the recording because we don't want to record everybody asking questions